Welcome everyone to today's event. It's part of the Center for Ethics and Human Values COMPAS program. COMPAS stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And this year, our series is focused on the benefits and limits of markets, especially with respect to maintaining open society. For more information on our program, please visit CEHV, that's for the center, cehv.osu.edu/COMPAS, C-O-M-P-A-S. I'm Piers Turner. I'm the director of the center and also an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy. And today what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little time talking about John Stuart Mill, who's perhaps the key intellectual figure in the history of these discussions about markets and open society. And he was a 19th century utilitarian philosopher and political economist. And he was famous in his day both as an egalitarian reformer and as a defender of individual liberty, especially his defense of freedom of discussion. Today, many readers know him primarily through his essay on liberty, but at the time he wrote extensively about the need for more egalitarian social, political, and economic relationships to address the problems associated with poverty and wage labor, inequality of wealth, in addition to what he called the aristocracies of color, race, and sex. How Mill balanced these various concerns can be instructive for us in our current moment, I believe. And so we're very fortunate today to have with us Dr. Helen McCabe. She is the author of a really excellent new book on Mill called John Stuart Mill, Socialist. Dr. McCabe is a political theorist in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham in the UK. She's also authored a number of leading articles on Mill's socialism, feminism, philosophy of persuasion, and his authorial relationship with Harriet Taylor Mill. Honestly, there's no better scholar working on Mill's political philosophy and political economy in the world today, and so I'm just thrilled that she's here to join us. Before I turn things over to Helen, though, for her opening remarks, let me just remind you to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. After Helen gives her presentation, I'll follow up with some discussion, and then we'll offer up as many of the questions from the audience as we can in the last 20 minutes or so. So with that, welcome to our series, Helen.
Thank you so much. And that, well, yeah, incredibly flattering introduction. It's really, honestly, I was just saying, a delight and an honour to be invited. I'm obviously sad that I haven't managed to visit Ohio State in person yet, but really it is the silver lining, isn't it, of the pandemic, that we've managed to organise so many exciting events online and talk to friends and hear exciting views and comments and questions from all over the world. So really very nice of you to have me. It's quite late here, it's pitch black, but I see it's very sunny where you are. Yeah, I don't quite know how to follow that introduction from Piers, but yes, just this book came out in March. It is the culmination of 20 years, nearly 20 years of research. I started this book as my undergraduate thesis a long time ago, and then it became my MPhil thesis, and then it became my doctoral thesis, and then very, very slowly it became a book. But I am delighted, as you can tell from my face when I show you the book, and I love its front cover. But in the book, although you can just admire it for its front cover and not read the content, that's also fine. I start by charting how I see Mill's intellectual progression from his very utilitarian radical upbringing by his father and Jeremy Bentham, where he says in the autobiography, kind of thought that their reforms were the last word in kind of improving a perfect society. And then he had a bit of a crisis of confidence in that, when he had a bit of a crisis of confidence in their whole system after his own, what he calls mental crisis, or crisis in my mental history. And I think that sort of biographically, that's the moment when Mill starts looking for reforms, future possibilities that are well beyond a kind of what we might now call a classical liberal laissez-faire kind of agenda, but which at the time, we should always remember, was incredibly radical. He just wanted to go, he thought there was something further. And so the second chapter kind of explores what socialism meant to Mill, because he was exploring these new, more radical socialist, more egalitarian, more fraternal, kind of social utopian, as we now call them, schemes by contemporary socialists. And I guess one of the important things I'm trying to show in that chapter is what socialism meant to Mill. And so when he says in the autobiography that by the mid-1840s, his political philosophy would be under the general designation of socialist, I'm trying to explore what the general designation of socialist might have looked like to him, because I think it's really easy for us to think that socialism is just Marx. Like Marx is a kind of monolithic definition in some respects of socialism, and Mill is like pre-Marx. I mean, they live at much the same time. Mill's slightly different generation, and so lots of Mill's exploration of socialism, lots of Mill's writing about socialism and his kind of intellectual engagement with socialism is all with socialists who were writing up, say, 1848, and that's when the Communist Manifesto was published. So it's kind of lots of the socialists that are being critiqued in the Communist Manifesto are the people that Mill was really interested in, both intellectually, and then also had some quite strong friendships with some of them, and some quite strong antipathies to some of them. They're a very, very mixed bunch. So then kind of that's the sort of history element, I guess. And one element of what I look at is Mill's critique of contemporary capitalism, how he agrees with certain critiques that are made by contemporary socialists of their system, and then also where he doesn't agree. And then I look at a kind of more detailed view of where Mill agrees with certain socialist schemes and where he also has some quite obvious disagreements. I mean, a really clear one is about whether socialism should be run by the state or whether it should be a much more grassroots, decentralized, markety system. And that's why lots of people who've engaged seriously with Mill socialism, there are not that many, but of the ones who have, most of them think that Mill is a kind of market socialist. I'm a kind of forerunner of that idea. So then moving away from kind of Mill's engagement with other socialist views, I try and build a picture of Mill's utopia. So unlike the utopian socialists, Mill does use the word utopia. In at least one essay he says, if I could, like other writers, have my utopia, would be this. And I argue anyway in the book that you can see a more detailed development of that utopia from that essay from 1845 in the first edition of the Principles, 1848, and even more in the future editions, particularly after 1852. And that's partly because that's where Mill really gets to know about producer cooperation and consumer cooperation and can have a lot of detail about those schemes from actual historical examples, both from France, so very interested in the workers' cooperatives that were set up in Paris after the 1848 revolution, and also from Lancashire, so my home county, indeed nearly my hometown, my family's hometown of Rochdale, and the Rochdale Pioneers. So look in kind of two ways at Mill's utopia. So one is about thinking about the kind of normative principles, I guess, that Mill is trying to balance underneath, as I would say it, a general commitment to utility. And the balance might be different, I would argue, at different periods of history, depending on what we can achieve of all of these principles. And so some are more important than others at different times, or might have more weight in a balance. And I argue that they are security, progress, liberty, equality, fraternity. And so that this, and obviously that is the standard of the French Revolution, but with this kind of interesting commitment to security and to progress, one of which is quite Hobbesian and very Benthamite, and one is sort of a bit more romantic maybe in this kind of tension we see in Mill's early upbringing crisis, although obviously his dad and Bentham are also very progressive radicals in terms of trying to change things. So then there's quite a lot of detail in the book about what I think Mill's commitments to those things look like, which we could talk about later, but you could also read it. And I'm very grateful to Piers and Piers' work already on Mill's egalitarianism, particularly for that section. I guess what's kind of most new in a way in the book is the section on fraternity. Mill's early critic Stephen saw it in Mill, right? He says that Mill is committed to liberty, equality, fraternity, and that's why he's a bad, like, liberal and a bad utilitarian. And since then, it hasn't really been engaged with that much. But I think it's a really kind of central theme in Mill and helps us understand his writings about utilitarianism and how he thinks that utilitarianism would work, and perhaps feeds into, you know, the endless debate about whether Mill was an act or a rule utilitarian. Like, I think it has lots of different applications. And then in the last bit, I talk about sort of more practical institutions that Mill's interested in, and they're kind of building on work I've already published before the book, talking about reforms that Mill thought were, as I put it in this triumvirate, accessible, so things we could do right now. And they are actually slightly more radical than we might think. So he thought lots of people could do producer cooperation right now. And that was being proven by the number of working people who were doing producer cooperation right now and consumer cooperation. And he's slightly more interested in producer cooperation for interesting reasons. I think about kind of autonomy at work, freedom at work, exercising your individuality. And then I think about what he thought was feasible in the kind of, you know, this one of the things he likes about utopian schemes is that they have this quite detailed thinking through, they have blueprints, they have a plan, and he kind of was interested in assessing what he thought about the feasibility of a plan, and that could be kind of economic feasibility, but also human psychology feasibility, and then I kind of think about the ideal, like what does Mill, and that's obviously slightly more sketchy, because Mill to some extent was worried about prescribing the future, because he thought the future would evolve and future institutions would be for the people of the future to decide and to build, and they would have a much better idea than we could about what was feasible 100 years in the future, even 10 years in the future. If producer cooperation took off, suddenly lots more things would be feasible. But I think we can still see some clear normative commitments in Mill to some quite radically and obviously socialist ideal institutions. So for instance, the principle of justice, that is from each according to his capacities to each according to his needs, which to some extent is kind of definitionally socialist, right? And I talk a bit about political institutions. I think that kind of really understanding Mill's commitment to egalitarianism and how that actually was in terms of, I would argue, a relational egalitarianism, where you recognise both each other's basic equality as human beings, but you also recognise each other's superiorities and your own inferiority in different ways, in a kind of complicated mix where we're all got some superiorities and some inferiorities usually, that helps explain like plural voting and things. And then the kind of very last bit of the conclusion is just a kind of general discussion about, you know, does this show us a path less travelled by socialism? Does it kind of open up opportunities for thinking about contemporary markets, contemporary life, contemporary capitalism, and to kind of not have to think that the only options are a completely free market with its benefits and disbenefits, or a completely centrally planned economy. And there are like a range of interesting other options, which might fit under a kind of Rawlsian idea of liberal socialism, but might not be, you'd have to use that kind of dichotomy, but might also not be a welfare state kind of Northern European social democratic view, but something else. So yeah, I think that's kind of it, if that summarizes it.
Great, thanks, Helen. That's great. So I want to now just try to tease out some bits of that, and if we can just talk about a little bit. Before, I think, going into sort of the more positive view you're putting on the table about Mill's kind of socialism and where that fits into our understanding of what he was proposing and sort of when he was proposing it and under what conditions, I guess the first thing is just to even be talking about Mill as a proponent of socialism, I think would be news to some people. And so I guess I think I'd like to just start kind of with placing your work and this book sort of in the context of Mill scholarship and or sort of general understandings of where Mill fits in sort of the political landscape, and how, and this feels like a bit of a corrective, right? It's sort of emphasizing a part of Mill that's not emphasized as much by others. And so how would you characterize that, like in terms of motivating the work in the first place?
Yeah, so I think, so I was really lucky that Michael Frieden was my undergraduate tutor at university, and I went to see him about doing a project on like for my undergrad dissertation about the liberal limits of toleration, right? Fascinating. I'm still a fascinating project that I should have done. maybe we'll come back to. And he said, oh no, that's too big for an undergraduate dissertation, which was like 15,000 words. You should do something nice and small. What about Mill and socialism? And I said, what about what? I mean, yeah, nice and small, right? Like it's 20 years later. But anyway, and I said, what? Like, I'd read Mill, I love Mill, I'm fascinated. We've read On Liberty, we've read Subjection of Women, we've read Utilitarianism. I was very passionate about defending Mill from what I thought were really bad arguments against different things he thought, or trying to show that he's very inconsistent as a thinker. I thought they were a bit kind of cheap shots often. But I had no idea that he had said this. And then Michael pointed me to the autobiography, which I hadn't read yet. And there it is, in black and white. Mill says his political theory was under the general designation of socialist. And obviously that leaves leeway. I think that's what's interesting in the project, is like, okay, well, how general? And what does socialism mean? And really my undergrad thesis was just a kind of lit review, because it was undergrad thesis, right, of the existing literature. And I guess you can be very interested in Mill and not interested in his political economy, right? And you can be very interested in Mill and not interested in his political theory. He has fascinating things to say about ethics and epistemology and logic, and what social science is, etc. That's one of the interesting things about him, right? He's such an amazing polymath. But I think if among people who are interested in political theory, some books just don't mention it at all, like he didn't say it. Some people have tackled it head on and just think he was mistaken. So there is this kind of two Mills thesis, sometimes it's called, where I think he was very inconsistent and he had two views, and you can't really reconcile them. So he was a utilitarian and a liberal, and you should have noticed you can't be both. And so I think there is a sort of maybe a view that he just didn't really understand what he was saying. There's definitely a view that he didn't mean it very long. There's quite a lot of discussion about whether he just meant it about sort of the mid-40s and then he retracted. And some of that is tied in with blaming Harriet Taylor Mill. So people see her as this much more radical socialist, kind of communist harpy who like forces him into saying things he doesn't really mean, and then as soon as she dies he writes on liberty and his kind of true liberalism comes back out again, totally ignoring the account in the autobiography about how that's a co-written text and the fact that you find bits on liberty in like earlier Harriet texts. And then there's a very small amount, it's a good but small amount of kind of serious engagement with Mill's socialism. So there's a little bit of work that's sort of tracing Mill's connection to specific contemporary socialists, and there's some really fascinating work by Bruce Baum about understanding Mill's principle of liberty in the economic sphere, so kind of moving freedom from just the social and political, which is what On Liberty is about, into the economic, which is what you can read Principles being about. And I guess also a little bit of engagement again with sort of like Mill's distributive principles, obviously your work and mine as well on Mill's egalitarianism. And then I thought Joe Persky's book was great about the political economy of progress and kind of situating where Mill gets to in terms of kind of egalitarianism, harmony, fraternity, justice inside of he's a trained political economist. I'm a political theorist, so like understanding the kind of economic underpinnings of that. But then of course Persky never mentions socialism, right? Like it's the whole book about how radical Mill is, and it gets to where he is and it doesn't call it what it's called.
Yeah, so calls it sort of Mill's radical egalitarianism. But I think there's one reason for that is, when you read Mill's very early essays, even before he met Harriet in the late 1820s, you can see him advocating for really pretty radical economic redistribution, especially through inheritance taxes. And he was interested in doing away with a system where the wealth in the country was in the hands of just a few families, and which alarmed some of his friends. And and so then you can see some of the sort of the egalitarian impulse. And then it seems clear that he accepted the kind of socialist critique of the laissez-faire system at the time. And so then the real question then was, well, what's the kind of positive when he calls himself a kind of qualified socialist? Yeah. And under that designation, as you've said, what is he signing up for? And I think, as you also said, to some extent, he leaves it open, but he then does also gesture, I think, sort of, like, well, what's the shape of this ideal a bit, what it might look like. And so let's shift to that part of it a little bit, because I think that was the second thing I really wanted to ask you about was, so as you laid out, right, that, one of the things I have found most important in your work that has just really affected the way I read everything in Mill is just always attending to, when is Mill making a recommendation about something for the near term? When is he making a recommendation about something that's sort of in the midterm, the foreseeable, but midterm kind of future? And when is he telling us something about, some distant ideal that isn't set in stone, but he has some idea based on sort of his utilitarian commitments, maybe thoughts about human nature and what we were capable of and the kinds of institutions we could inhabit, sort of when he's saying something about this distant ideal. And I think, you know, what you're saying is, look, when he's making those claims about that distant ideal, it's not just like very egalitarian in terms of kind of relational equality and things he says about women and like the subjection of women and the kind of relationships that would exist between people in social context. Also in this political economy context, it looks like he's signing up for, ultimately, as a matter of justice, kind of some kind of socialist picture. So is that right? I mean, and so like, what are the elements of that ideal then? And then also, how should we understand, like when you're reading him then, so what does that mean? How should we take like the midterm stuff and the near term stuff that he's saying? Like what, you know, what Mill as a thinker, how do you read him constructively?
No, and I think that's
we're
the
not
challenge.
getting him wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge, and it's a challenge with all. I mean, the whole methodological school, right, from Cambridge about that as theorists we should pay attention, and if you don't want to pay attention, then you should be honest about. You can't really say this is Mill's view. You could say like it's a Millian view, or I found this great idea on liberty and I'd like to explore it, but don't try and kind of recruit Mill on your side, unless you're sure like that you are saying what he was saying. But I guess I mean it does take a bit of work. I think I guess I would encourage that, and it's probably true for all sort of understanding all history of political thought, isn't it? And it is compounded by, as I was saying, that Mill's a polymath, and part of that is also that he has played many roles. So there's Mill, the like newspaper journalist, there's Mill, the politician. You've got a picture of him just behind your head that I was admiring earlier, of him in a member of parliament. There's Mill, the civil servant. There's Mill, the like anonymous radical agitator. There's Mill, the like public intellectual, writing books that you know, with his name on them. There's Mill, the kind of agitating revolutionary in France, who's like, you know, and there's Mill, the kind of like deeply not revolutionary about Ireland. So there's, you know, there's a whole host of roles that he plays, and I think he wrote a huge amount of stuff, right? So we have to pay attention to kind of the genre that he's writing and kind of where he is in life. But then I think also, if you thought about how anybody here's complete works, as it were, if that now involved all our tweets, all our emails, all our letters, anything we might have written as an academic, you would see that, you know, quite often you know, it's not uncommon, right? It's not weird that people have really strong opinions about which party to vote for in the next election, or which policy platform a particular politician should put forward, and they also have like really far removed from that views about what an ideal world would look like. And that is part of human life, right? That we end up voting, or if we're sort of sensible adults, we end up voting for somebody, not just withdrawing our vote because we don't like any of the candidates too much. I mean, depending on how bad they all are, but you know, that like we have to kind of make compromises. That's what politics is about. And Mill is a political agent and a political actor, as well as a political theorist. And so I think there's that kind of difference. And then, of course, there's a complication that he changes his mind about some things, his views develop. I would never argue that Mill was a socialist in the 1820s. Like, he definitely has loads of issues with Owenism and is a hardcore utilitarian radical. I just don't think you can say that because he said something in a debate in London in 1824, he also thought that in 1864, right? And that's the difference. I mean, I think there are some, I mean, my article on Mill persuasion, right, hopefully gives you some clues a little bit, but some of it you just have to kind of work out. And I think with some central texts, like, so for instance, subjection, I think there's a lot of critique of subjection that probably isn't very fair, in that Mill is just throwing every argument he can think of into the soup to get women the vote and the right to divorce and the right to own some property. Like, anything that might persuade somebody, it's all in there. And it might not be the best feminism, and it might not be the best thought through feminism, but it's just like the kitchen sink. Whereas something much more kind of considered is probably like much less politically practical. And so I think it's fascinating to try and work out where on liberty sits in some respects. And I think one of the things about liberty is that it has a mix. It has this quite theoretical, you know, a final goal should be that we never interfere with each other when we're not harming each other kind of idea. And then it has a chapter on applications, which are obviously really right now, some of which don't even exist anymore, right? Because they're very, very, very Victorian, like in terms of what they're thinking about. So then I guess obviously the same thing happens with, I would argue, with his writings about kind of economic futures. But there are some really clear commitments to a really radically different, definitely socialist future in Mill. And then there were some interesting policy applications for, like, you know, should we have this kind of poor relief or this other kind of poor relief, which are only really applicable to exactly when he wrote the articles.
Yeah, so in a minute, I think I want to sort of come back to sort of questions people might have of how this is kind of all related to then what he says about liberty. And we've already got one question about that in the Q&A. But just to make sure we've really got kind of the sort of positive picture a bit more on the table, I guess I would just sort of reinforce what you just said there at the end. It's like when he is speaking in a certain kind of way about certain ideals, I mean, you just can't ignore that in terms of he's always weighing various kinds of values and trying to find the right balance between them. Liberty is clearly one of those values. There's no doubt that that's one of them. But to read it as if that's the core of the picture and then he's not weighing it against, for instance, a kind of relational equality, I think really misses Mill. And I think that there are passages that if you're not sort of thinking about that, you really don't, you're just like, where is this coming from? So for instance, I mean, he talks about individuality a lot and the importance of that, but he also says in a place that On Liberty itself that, well, sure, he cares about individuality, but he cares about sort of social harmony and sociality even more than he cares about individuality. Or he has passages where he says, in an ideal situation, I would so identify my good with everyone else's good that, for instance, if we're, I wouldn't want to get paid more than other people. And this is really surprising, right? You might think, well, like, but isn't there this free market Mill who, I mean, what is this like social harmony kind of focused Mill, and where is that coming from? And then, and I do, and how should we relate that to passages, which I'm going to bring up in a minute, where he seems to emphasize the other side of the story. Do you just want to say one last thing about sort of what this ideal really is and for him?
Yes, I think you quoted a great passage there, right? So I think, I think, right, this could all be wrong, that Mill is really committed to this future of what he describes about interpersonal relationships, right, of perfect equality, and of harmony, and of this real, you quote, past it for utilitarianism, right, this bit where he says, we'd have this harmony of interests such that it would almost be impossible for me to act in a way that was contrary to your interests, just as much as it is now for any well brought up young person to murder somebody. That we would just have this like really internalized concern for each other. And I think that is about a concern about people being real people and having equal value with yourself. And definitely, has great passages where he points out that one of the reasons we can just get away with awful things in the world is that we just don't think some people count. Just don't think they're worth as much, and so it's fine to override all their interests because they don't weigh as much in the balance as everybody else. I mean, and that is a big theme in the minute, right? About the fact that we don't recognize each other as properly equal, or as meaningful as each other, or as lives as valuable as each other. And I think Mill thinks in the future we really will. And then part of that, I think, is a recognition about how we interact. So it obviously wants a future in which people can freely develop their individuality. I think that's kind of a bad word sometimes in Mill, that we think it means individual, and actually it means like your own uniqueness and like what makes you a different person, your own character kind of thing. So we'll be able to have these kind of fully formed, rounded characters, but none of us will be sociopaths, I guess. Like we won't pursue that kind of development of our own selves at the expense of other people's interest and well-being. And then I think he has fascinating views about how we should really like divorce our efforts from what we expect from society, which is keyed into, right, from each according to his capacities to each according to his needs. Like Mill just envisages a future where I will want to contribute, and that will be entirely separate from what I get in return. And so I won't go to work just because I get paid, and I won't go to work and be ambitious at work because then I'll get a pay rise. I'll go and do whatever it is I do because I care about it and I care about society and people in it. And then I will get back from society what I need, or some kind of understanding of what would be fair for me to have. And I won't begrudge other people getting more. And I won't feel great about myself because I get more. I'll recognize that it's because we all have like different needs. And that I just think that is socialism, like that's kind of what it's about. And Mill has interesting views about how we might get there, but I think that's the crux. And then that is right, liberty, equality, fraternity, like properly understood. And you can't have one without the other.
So it raises a question that I think we can't address here because we just have to leave it to the future of humanity, which is how unrealistic is that picture? Obviously, he put a lot of faith in the idea that education over time would allow individuals to develop their characters in certain ways that would allow us to inhabit new kinds of institutions that would then, in turn, I think, allow us to continue to develop as individuals that would then allow us to develop new institutions. And so, you know, how unrealistic that is, I think, I think people have fairly worried that Mill is unrealistic about sort of where this is headed. But I think for our purposes here is to not see that at least there's a direction that he was interested in is to miss out on, I think, a big part of his view. So let me just then shift, I think, begin to start to raise some sort of maybe the key question, although we're getting more questions in the Q&A, and I encourage other people to do so as well. And I'm writing them down. So the first thing is just to say, you know, we got a question specifically about Mill's liberty principle, but more generally, like, so how do we square some of what we've been talking about with, you know, not just Mill's liberty principle, but also, you know, he was, when it came to commerce, a kind of free trader. He was skeptical of central planning, even in the kinds of socialism that he was advocating. He saw the benefits, at least in the near and midterm, of competition, although he also wanted to support some cooperation. And more generally, right, he did put the onus, at least, on those who would introduce coercive restrictions on individual liberty. He thought you could meet that burden and you could justify interference in a number of cases, many cases, in fact, but he did put the onus on them. So there is this Mill who's like pro individual liberty, pro free trade, nervous about certain kinds of things that defenders of individual liberty are often nervous about, like with regard to central planning. And so and then you've got this liberty principle, which people read in different ways, but also seems to be about trying to create a sphere of action within which a person is free from government interference. So how do we sort of just put this together in a system where we're also taking account of the more egalitarian socialistic elements?
So I think the really central thing is that Mill is not a state socialist, and that you can be a socialist and not a state socialist is, I guess, maybe something we forget, because history has taken a more state-centric approach where people have tried socialism. It's tended to be capturing the state by either political or more violent means and trying to use the power of the state to enforce the achievement of socialism kind of all in one go. And Mill is a grassroots-led, incrementalist, and a very decentralized socialist. So I think, and that's why I said earlier, people are, you know, identifying with market socialism, and they're not wrong. I mean, I have an article about them might be slightly wrong, that Mill's like a kind of slightly post-market socialist, but in the main, I think that's quite a good way of thinking about Mill. There will be, in Mill's ideal future, there will be autonomous, worker-owned, democratically run by the workers, cooperatives, both producer and consumer, and they will interact in something that looks like a market. They'll trade, they might trade at cost price, he talks about at some point, like, because we might lose a profit motive, especially once we all realize our dual identities as both producers and consumers. So if you're a producer, the way you make profit is out of selling, but you're selling to yourself, right? Because you're the consumer. So, and I think he thinks cooperatives kind of help make that clear to people, particularly where you use something like the Rochdale consumer cooperative model, where any profit in the end is divided amongst all the members of the cooperative anyway. So anything you've spent, like, in the kind of comes back to you, so there isn't kind of profit. So I think, well, there's certainly interaction and trade. I think it's interesting, Mill doesn't really like middlemen, so there might be a lot fewer shops in the future. Everyone we might think about free markets, but definitely no restrictions on what people will be trading, probably not on how they'd be trading. And I don't think it would be by government fiat that we all worked in producer cooperatives, because Mill thinks that once you've experienced working in a workers' cooperative, if you're a decent worker, you would never go back to working in a like wage economy situation. But I mean, Mill thinks there should be some government provision, but I mean, it's quite minimal. So street lights, roads, maybe railways. He has a thing about how everything that tends to monopoly, why should people kind of just through good brute luck get monopoly profits because they own the land that's got oil under it? We should share those out amongst everybody else, but that leaves a huge amount of stuff that we wouldn't. And even when he's thinking about state provision, he's really often thinking about local government provisions, like local government gasworks for utility. So, and then obviously land is the big one, right? So land is the more separate thing of like, he actually is pretty committed. I mean, there's complicated elements of the view, but in the end, I think he's committed to land nationalisation of some, not by like fiat, but over time. And then
he says if we're starting a new country,
let people have private property land, right?
Yeah.
And so we've got to find a way of getting to that stage, but in a fair way that respects security and justice and equality of the people in the situation that we have at the minute. So that, I mean, that's kind of the real kind of, I guess, difference from lots of laissez-faire and kind of classical liberal thoughts, I think.
So let me just linger on two parts of this, still thinking about this question. So one is, well, first is that I think you emphasize in the book the way actually for Mill, socialism was liberty promoting. And I think and I think maybe just the key point that you're getting at is the way in which he viewed wage labor as kind of a form of, I mean, slavery might be too strong, but he basically says that. And he's very concerned about the ways in which people are being dominated through kind of these wage relationships. And so one of the things he's trying to solve is that. And then you can't think about that without him then seeing something like worker cooperatives, producer cooperatives as actually a way of trying to make people more free.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and so I think that's, I mean, you can see that in the kind of way he eulogizes the you know, people who really scrimped and saved and starved themselves in order to save like pence and set up the first cooperatives in Paris and in Rochdale and other bits of England, that he admires their commitment to liberty to such an extent that they make sacrifices and kind of and then he shows how you know, even quite stringent discipline, workplace discipline, if you put it on yourself, then that's much more free than if your boss just tells you that's what you've got to do. And I think there's all sorts of interesting ways of exploring why worker democracies would make you more free. And then I think there's an interesting interaction, which we talk about in the book, between practicing democracy in the workplace, practicing democracy in the political sphere, like how those both educate people to do democracy better in both.
Mm-hmm. But also to put maybe even more to the point of the question, then I think is that, I mean, Mill did identify, at least it seems to me, but you tell me, this kind of limiting case where he was nervous about what he called communism as a kind of extreme form of socialism, that he did think, well, that might require a set of arrangements that would be incompatible with the kind of individual liberty. So going back to what I was saying about.
So I think it's really interesting. So obviously earlier on, so what he means by communism, and I think we think it's going to be the USSR, and what he means is Owen and Cabet, so systems where everybody shares everything equally, no matter what you kind of put in, where people live in quite small, well, for Owen it's quite small, for Cabet it's the whole of society, but doesn't need to be a very big country. And I think Mill thinks that the endless kind of observance of each other in these quite small communities, this like enforcement of equality could, and so in the 20s he definitely thinks will like destroy kind of individuality. And then in the Principles he has a slightly more nuanced take of like, well, it's still up for, you know, it's to be debated whether there would be any space left for the free development of individuality if we had this kind of communism. And then he says, unfortunately that's fine, because our only options aren't contemporary capitalism, he doesn't use the word capitalism, but contemporary society or communism, because there's plenty of options in between. But you're absolutely right that, and I mean that seems obvious from thinking about what he thinks of the threats to liberty on liberty, that everybody having the same education, everybody having the same kind of accommodation, everybody watching each other all the time, because we live in these very small communities and we're all working together, and we all recognize that, you know, one lazy person means that everybody's share goes down because the total share, the pie is smaller that we all get a slice of, could lead to a huge amount of social pressure to conform. But I think that's also what's in Mill's head, which I think is also what's in his head in Liberty, right? That it would be a really coercive social environment, not necessarily what I think we often think is a danger of communism, state communism, looking at history, that it would be states enforcing a kind of lack of liberty on people.
Great. So in the background of this question, I think is also, so I'm just going to read we have a question from my colleague, Eric McGilvray, who I should say is actually the coordinator of this series. I just happen to be the one introducing this particular event. And he asks, this question generally about, I think.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question.
Yeah, it's about socialism, but I mean, I think knowing Eric's interest too, it's also about, I think, the tradition of liberalism. Like, to what extent is socialism, can socialism be understood to be sort of consistent with the liberal tradition? So what Eric asks really is, he says, what would you say are the parameter conditions of Mill's socialism? What assumptions does he make about the world that, if they turned out to be wrong, might have caused him to change his mind? Is there anything we've learned in the last 150 years that you think might have shaken his commitment to socialism? So, and that's really a question like, well, when, people these days, when people talk about socialism, how should we really be understanding that term? That I think then, I mean, I'm putting words in Eric's mouth, that allow us to make judgments about, for instance, the compatibility of socialism, properly understood, with something like open society or the liberal tradition more generally.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not really sure what I think the parameter conditions are, but because I don't know if I really know what that means, but which is my fault. But I guess Mill thinks socialism is available to a certain elite of the working class, who are able to make sacrifices in order to achieve autonomy. He calls it the yoke of capital at one point, of having to pay somebody else to use their capital, and so they free themselves from that through their own sacrifice and efforts. They are like collectively minded, but like fiercely independent, because they want to work on their own and be their own masters, but they do it in a collective fashion. He thinks that they are like psychologically competent to do this kind of producer cooperation, and he encouraged people to do it. I mean, one of the things you can see about the way that he republishes elements of principles, makes cheap editions of principles, was in order to kind of use at least part of the book as a kind of educational textbook for people who wanted to experiment with cooperation. He sent money to support cooperatives, he sent money to support leading cooperators. He befriended exiled cooperators from after the 1848 revolution, and like forever hated Napoleon III. So I think there are a certain kind of people that he thinks can do some socialism, and there's a huge number of people who thinks can't do any socialism yet, right? People who really won't do any work at all unless their boss is standing over them being like, do that now, and now do that, and now do that, and who take wage labor as a kind of a battle with their employer to do as little as possible for as much as possible, and they just see this kind of warring parties, and he thinks that cooperators kind of release themselves from that war and strife as well through their own kind of independence. So I guess he thinks that kind of like a long process of seeing cooperation at work, recognizing that it's better in lots of ways if you're the worker, and also harder if you're the worker, because you have to take responsibility, and we have to be self-motivating, and like you have to do democracy, which is often boring and hard, and go to meetings and like make decisions. That people will see that it's better. People who want to make a profit will see that these companies are more profitable, and they'll invest in them at a kind of fixed rate of return. And so eventually there'll be this kind of organic movement of the economy. And obviously that hasn't happened. So that's something I think we have learned in the last 150 years, that cooperation had a real, we forget how big and radical a movement it was, and how many cooperatives there were across Britain and across other stretches of Europe. And I think we also slightly forget how many cooperatives there still are in the US. We don't talk about them, but there are loads in Spain, even here in Britain, the home, the original home of cooperation is still, lots of shops, right, are the co-op, if you go to them. They're not necessarily run on entirely cooperative principles anymore. So I think, that's maybe shown us that capitalists weren't tempted to invest and would rather kind of have, on Mill's account, on Socialist account, kind of dominate. They'd rather have the domination than the money to some extent. Or it might show us something about how we would all rather kind of have private property than share. and then we're not kind of ready. But I guess it's one of those things, isn't it, always about a counterfactual. Like, just because it hasn't yet happened doesn't necessarily mean it's not psychologically feasible, just that we haven't yet had the right kind of social education about it.
But other options. So, there are people like Eric Olin Wright, who until, he died recently, but he's still pushing cooperatives in as sort of a model even recently. But I guess there is this question of like, well, given the options that got on the table in the 20th century, would Mill have thought that something like, a Danish kind of social welfare model?
And you just say it's because we disagree, right?
I'm just asking.
So I think
would have been a kind of a balance of his egalitarian.
I know why you think, and I agree. There's a kind of million way of thinking about all of the options, which is just like, some options weren't on the table for Mill. He could have waited, but if somebody said to him, "How about social democracy? Works like this," he might have said, "Oh yeah, that achieves all the principles I'm interested in, and it happens peacefully, and everybody votes for it democratically. That's the point of being social democracy."
I'm glad we agree then.
Let's do it. And I think I have a tension. My only tension is that I really think Mill doesn't really like the state, and so I guess there is a worry that Mill thinks that social democracy kind of enervates people. And I think to some extent, I mean, so in the UK, right, I think there was this real passionate push to found the NHS, right, based out of people's actual experience of how awful it was not having a national health service in the 20s and the 30s and in the war, and that there was this real radical push that what we were going to do after the war in founding a brave new world was we were going to have free healthcare. Free at the point of access, and I think people were like, that was a democratic decision. Both main political parties got behind it. It was like properly, everyone was committed to it. And now we're not, like, we've privatized bits of it, and so everybody kind of pays lip service to like, oh, we should have an NHS. But whether it's a living truth with Mill, right, or has become a bit of a dead dogma because we've had it for so long and we don't really know the badness of the alternative. And I guess, I mean, it's not impossible that also happens with more decentralized systems, but I think there's perhaps a danger of it happening more with a big centralized system where hardly any individual person has a stake in how it goes or understands kind of like the way that their contribution comes back, apart from like individual doctors and nurses, right, and individual people who've had their lives saved by the NHS like me. But like, I think there is a kind of, so I think there might be a thing in Mill about the distance between you and the kind of the state that means that we don't get the sort of fraternity and equality we're looking for. But I think it's one of those questions too that we can't possibly answer, because Mill might just say something totally crazy, like just you're not expecting, right, if you actually talk to him about it. But I definitely see where you're coming, and I guess that's my only kind of slight concern about whether he would support social democracy. Yeah.
So just extending that thought then, I think people might wonder here, so how should we think about the relationship sort of philosophically between Mill and Marx? Where if we're thinking about the socialist tradition, and you've got a book called John Stuart Mill, Socialist, and we associate that tradition really with Marx as the major thinker, because he superseded those earlier thinkers you were talking about. Where does Mill really fit into this tradition, and where, especially theoretically, like related to Marx, where do they really differ also?
Yeah, so they really differ in, well, it's hard to tell, isn't it? I think Marx thinks we should violently capture the machinery of the state, and Mill doesn't, except in exceptional circumstances like 1848, and Marx thought it in 1848 too, so they're quite similar but like different. I think that Marx probably, it's hard to tell because it's not that easy always to tell Marx thinks, right? And we have a kind of received view of what Marx thinks. It might not really be Marx. It might be Marx as interpreted by Lenin and Stalin, etc. But I think Marx probably thinks something about kind of like the sort of catharsis of evolution is necessary to really get rid of the false ideology of capitalism. And so that's one of the reasons that he is very dismissive of utopian socialists as writing recipes for the cookshops of the future. And I think Mill is totally the opposite. He's like, you can burn it down, but only when you've got a blueprint for what's coming after. And like a feasible blueprint written by a decent architect, if we can kind of know what that would be. So that I think is a real difference. Mill is much more of an incrementalist, and I think he thinks it's possible to be more incremental in achieving reform, which, to feedback to Eric's question, Mill might be wrong, right, about that. It might show that Marx or Marxists are right about how much you have to smash before you can build something new. But we might also think, well, that's a sign that we shouldn't do it then, because Mill's right about the cost involved in that. So Mill, very, very convinced that we just have a revolution, burn it all, we'll be back in a Herbartian state of nature, and we'll have like 10,000 years, 20, 50,000 years, human progress to go through until we get back to exactly where we are now. So why smash it without a plan? But I mean, he has nuanced views about radical revolution, which I've written about elsewhere. I think also Mill's not German. I mean, that sounds to be the obvious thing, but like, he doesn't come at the thoughts with this like Kantian Hegelian idealism. He comes at all of it with a real kind of like Scottish empiricism, and so I think that just does give him a different view. It's one of the reasons he writes so differently, and I think it might be one of the reasons why he's interested in kind of in questions about feasibility and what works. I think there's fascinating work to be done by somebody who really understands Marx and somebody who really understands Mill at the same time in a joint book, because if you stripped away some of the Germanic language about like alienation, I think you find a lot of similar areas in Mill. And then I was thinking it's really interesting that they both see themselves as social scientists, and like what their view of science is. They're both kind of founding social scientists. So where the kind of more scientific Marx would differ or be the same as the social scientist Mill, they're obviously both hugely influenced by exactly the same economics, and Marx is hugely influenced by Mill's principles of economy, but in a different way. It takes a much more radical view of what classical economics is showing us than Mill does. But they also have like loads of similarities, like a labour theory of value. Like there's just lots of stuff that's the same. And there are obviously at least two books by Mill and Marx, but I think neither's written by two scholars who are equally good at both, and kind of equally have a principle of charity for both, I guess, which is, I think, probably needed if that real work was to be done.
Yeah, I would mention the book you said earlier. Joseph Persky has a book. His book on Mill has a nice chapter on.
It does, yeah, it's very good.
The Marx and Mill similarities and differences. We're starting to get close to the end of time.
Yeah, and the questions.
But are there questions? One of the questions I want to get to is Harriet. Harriet Taylor Mill, who ultimately was Mill's wife, but a longtime collaborator with him on a lot of his work. And of course, there are lots of, you mentioned the two Mills thesis earlier, a lot of people who want to say Mill was really of two minds, partly.
And they're two completely different minds, right?
Attributing it to Harriet, and I'm fairly unconvinced by those kinds of proposals, but then how should we understand Harriet's role in this part of Mill's work anyway, with regard, his interest in socialism and egalitarianism more broadly?
So you can say, yeah, thanks, Meredith. It's a really great question. I don't know if you've spotted that I've got Harriet in my ears. These are my like conference earrings. And my kind of cheat answer a little bit is that I don't know yet, but I have a book contract for a book on Mill and Harriet, which is due at the end of March. So I need to know soon. I need to make my mind up really soon. So that's with the same publishers. So hopefully we'll have an equally exciting cover or something. So you're absolutely right that lots of Mill's egalitarian commitments existed before he met Harriet Taylor, and that hers existed before she met John Stuart Mill. He says about the principles, which I guess is where most of his socialism is sort of discernible, even though there is a book called Chapters on Socialism, but I think that's quite similar to the negative account of the principles and lacks the kind of positive bit. He says of the principles that she said it needed a chapter about the probable futurity of the labouring classes, which becomes the chapter which has these incredibly long discussions of cooperation and kind of examples and like literally how to do it, like how, the profit margins there, and that he would have finished it with the chapter on the stationary state, and then we would have finished that book with a chapter on stationary state and then moved on to the kind of government applications in book 5. And she said, no, you need something else. And then he says that she suggested that chapter, and then parts of that chapter, or lots of that chapter, was written in words taken from her own lips. And so that has kind of fed this theory that she's the socialist, and people say that that's the only socialist chapter in the book and she dictated it. I have a discussion about the kind of nitty-gritty of that, but I don't think it is the only socialist chapter. I mean, the chapter on property is pretty engaged with socialism, for instance, in the previous volume of Principles. But I also think it's unlikely that Harriet Taylor dictated all of that chapter, not least because, as I just said, chunks of it are like an account in French about this guy's house painting business. Like, who would have memorized that, like, to dictate it, right? It's obviously actually an account of his accounts. But I think what Mill actually says when you parse it a little bit more and read the next lines of the autobiography is that what that chapter sets up, or certainly in 1848 and still a little bit later, and there's a reflection of the earlier work on the claims of labour, is that there are sort of two theses about how class relationships should work. One is that what he calls, what Harriet Taylor and Mill call the theory of dependency. And you see that fitting into everything they write about gender, about race, about politics, that there is this theory that employers, capitalists, aristocrats, landowners should be like the husband, and that working classes should be dependent on them. And so the middle and upper classes should do all the direction, they should own all the property, and workers should work and they should take direction. But then they don't have any kind of like moral responsibility either, right? They are dependent like children in that sense. And so there was one way of critiquing contemporary capitalism and its horrors was that we should go back to a much more feudal relationship of dependency. And Mill has these long arguments with Arthur Helps, who into you know, many years after his first interaction with the essay, Helps's Taylor's essay in the Claims of Labour. And that's one theory. And then there's this other theory that the working class should be independent. And that then you think they should have the vote, and you probably should think that they should be working in cooperatives and managing their own capital. And so that is the distinction that the chapter on the probable futurity of the labouring population is really trying to get at, is like, are we going down this dependency back to feudalism route, or are we going towards an independent future for the working class and everything that would imply in terms of social, political and economic change? And I think he thinks that is she saw that those are the choices. And kind of helped him think through critique of both of them, positives and negatives. And obviously he thinks one's much more positive, the independence route is much more positive. Then he also says that she helped him see that there's a difference between that he already recognised from reading some other socialists that there's a difference between the laws of production and the laws of distribution. And although the laws of production are as fixed as the passage between night and day, they're just fixed by science. The laws of distribution are human choices and constructs, and so they can be changed, and they also have a normative element, and society is more or less to blame if it doesn't change them when it can. And he says he knew that already, but that she made it a living principle that pervaded the whole book. And so I think, given this, if you don't see this distinction, you can't really do socialism to some extent. I mean, maybe Marx thinks you can, because you see that the laws of production are totally different to what people tell you they are. But one of the ways I think Mill gets to a space where we can do socialism is that he says, yeah, sure, like a particular piece of land is only ever going to make X amount of corn, however good we are at agriculture. But how we divide that up is our choice. Who owns that land, who works it, who gets the different kinds of remuneration, those are human decisions. And sometimes it may be more or less feasible to do it one way or the other, but we have to recognise that is a human construct and choice, and we could do something different. And so I guess that would be how I think she thinks, certainly in that book. That was a long answer, sorry.
But it's actually, I was tempted to ask one last question, because I do want to end on time for everyone. But that's a wonderful place to end, because I think it speaks to the general point, which is that thinking about Mill on markets and open society, he thought there were choices and there's challenges of balancing these various values, but he didn't see them as like inherently opposed to each other, socialism and open society. And he was trying to find a path that would make them reconcilable. And I think that's exactly why I wanted to have an event today, talking to you about sort of the kind of model Mill gives us for thinking about these issues today.
Well, no, thank you. If we keep it going for a little bit, I can try and type an answer to some of these specific questions, because it's really nice of people to ask questions. But also, yeah, just to say, you're absolutely right. I think that for Mill, the open society and socialism are entirely compatible. depending on what we mean by those two words. And then I think that's one of the interesting things about his thoughts, whether it's right or wrong. I just think it's interesting in terms of like that being a possibility that we could seriously engage with and discuss.
Well, we'll save the questions, and then that'll give you a chance to follow up with people after. But for everyone out there, thank you very much for tuning in. And again, please go to cehv.osu.edu/COMPAS, COMPAS, to learn about upcoming events from our center. And we hope to see you there. Thanks so much.